Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure today to share this roundtable with three exceptional scholars in Latin American economy. So I am delighted to introduce you Professor Enrique Mendoza from the University of Pennsylvania, also Professor Carlos Vegh from Johns Hopkins University, and of course, Professor Jesús Fernández Villaverde, also from the University of Pennsylvania. So we will have a roundtable about the reasons and the consequence of the sovereign crisis in Latin America in the 1980s. So thank you very much, professors, to be here and share with us your insights about this major event in the Latin American economic history. I would like to start talking a little bit about the cause of the reasons behind the Latin American debt crisis. And I would like to start with Professor Enrique Mendoza. And my first question about this crisis would be, many economic historians associate the sovereign debt crisis of the 1980s with what happened in the previous decade, with what some scholars call the late growth era that characterized Latin America in the 1970s. My first question would be, why Mexico was able to borrow large sum of money during the 1970s?
Thank you very much, Ivan, for the question. And let me just start by giving you my admiration for the job you have done with the creation of this course, Jesus, and for the work you have done, Ivan. This is, from what I have seen, an amazing project, and I'm very glad and grateful for the opportunity to be part of it. Let me get to your question since the time is limited. So just a little bit of history of why Mexico was able to borrow like this. Well, has a lot to do with the geopolitics of the 1970s. The fact is that oil prices jumped right after the embargo that OPEC did on the United States in 1973 because of its support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And then they jumped again in what's known as the second oil shock right after the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War in 1970-80. So to put a sense in magnitude, in nominal terms, oil prices were about $2 in 1972. And they went up to about $38 by the end of 1979. And that may seem low by today's standards, but if you adjust it for inflation, it's about $150. So it was a massive increase in oil prices and very rapid. So that resulted in two things that are relevant to answer your question. The first thing has to do with the supply side. In order for Mexico to borrow a lot, there had to be a lot of funds that were loanable to Mexico. There were these large capital outflows at these very high oil prices from advanced economies to the oil-producing countries, particularly those in the Middle East. And those recycled back into the global capital markets in the form of what came to be known as the petrodollars cycle. So the supply of loanable funds in the global markets grew very sharply as a result. And this explains in part why Mexico was able to borrow so much. That's the supply side. Now, from the demand side, Mexico discovered, as the blessing or the curse of commodities, as the literature calls it sometimes, it discovered large oil reserves in 1976 in a place that we call in Mexico the Cantarell Field. It's off the Gulf Coast in the Campeche Bay in the east side of Mexico. Now, we had at that time a populist, nearly socialist government. A gentleman was president called José López Portillo, who, as many of the leaders in the region who were also populists, treated these commodity price shocks, in the case of Mexico, the oil price shock, as a permanent increase. So they went and borrowed heavily, thinking that the country was just permanently wealthier, mainly in the form of syndicated bank loans. So the debt ratio in Mexico was about 25% in 1975, 76, went up to 60% in 1982. And that's just the federal debt. It's not including the debt of the small and of the government enterprises that I know you want to talk about later. So yeah, I mean, it was that was that. It was both supply and demand.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendoza. Now we'd like to pose a question to Professor Carlos Vegh. And my question is, most observers consider Mexico unilateral suspension of payments, so the Mexico moratorium in August 1982, as the beginning of the Latin American sovereign debt crisis. However, before that, between 1980 and 1981, we have several banking and currency crises in the region. particularly in Argentina and in Uruguay. My question would be, why those crises not led to a regional crisis at the same level that the Mexican default did?
Yeah. First of all, thank you much for having me. So I mean the first point that I would like to do is that we should also include Chile in addition to Argentina and Uruguay to complete the Southern Cone, because that is the first step to answer that question, which is that banking and currency crisis that happened in 81 and 82 in all the three Southern Cone countries, had to do with the implementations of the famous or infamous, depending on how you want to call them, implementations of the tablitas, which were exchange rate based as stabilization programs that came to a very explosive end in 82 in Argentina and in 82 in Uruguay, also in Uruguay, and then in 82 in Chile. And the main reason for the debacle of this exchange revitalization was the fact that fiscal deficit was completely out of wax in Argentina in 1982 and in Uruguay, in Argentina in 1981 and in Uruguay in 1982, to the point that the fiscal deficit in Uruguay of 1982 was 18% of GDP. So as we all teach our students, if you have a peg or a fixed exchange rate and you have to issue the domestic credit to finance 18% of GDP, you of course have a textbook balance of payment crisis a la Paul Krugman. So all these tablitas exploded in 91, in 81, and then in 82 with the huge current account crisis, and with huge banking crisis. But the key point to answer your question here is that if you look at the regions, we did not see other countries that have followed the same very tough fixed exchange rate tools to reduce very high inflation. And therefore, because they are were not other countries that share some of the same macroeconomic problems, then you cannot have contagion because contagion, as you know, takes place if you have countries other than the countries that are in crisis that share some macroeconomic features of the countries that have been hit. And as I said, I mean, that was not the case in the case of the Southern Cone stabilization, and that explains why there was no contagion coming out.
Okay, thank you very much.
Southern stabilization programs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Vegh. Now, I would like to come back to that discussion about the supply side of these large capital inflows toward Latin America in the 1970s. So my next question is for Professor Jesús Fernández Villaverde. And my question would be, why did foreign investors lend a lot to Latin America in comparison to other regions? If we are thinking in how investors allocate their capital, it seems like they have several options in the 1970s. They could invest in East Asia or also in Western Europe. So why Latin America? We talked a little bit about that with Professor Mendoza about beyond Mexico, why the region in general was so attractive.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of ideas. First, Enrique already mentioned the oil crisis in 1973 and then the second oil shock in 1979. Let me go back 2 years earlier to 1971 with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods arrangement, the post-war arrangement from 1944, and the fact that Nixon abandoned, or the United States abandoned, the Bretton Woods arrangements. That basically means that during the 1970s, the international monetary system is in a situation that has been unprecedented, and where there is clearly no way in which we can coordinate economic policy between or among the leading nations. And that leads to a situation where strong capital flows, like the accumulation of reserves on oil-producing countries of their earnings from oil, are difficult to manage. I have this view of the world, which one day I need to write in a formal model, but I have kind of informally discussed in many presentations, that when there is a lot of liquidity in a financial market, that liquidity is like hot steam going through a piping system. And that hot steam is always going to get out through the weakest link of the piping system. And in this case, it's the weakest link of the financial sector at the international level. So you have a lot of liquidity, you have a lot of banks that are searching for yield, for getting better returns, and suddenly you have a bunch of Latin American countries that, as Enrique was saying, not only Mexico, but all across the region, are very willing for a number of internal political reasons to borrow. So suddenly you are Bank of America, you are Citicorp, you are saying, great, I have all these big deposits from Arab countries and I need to offer them enough yield, and I have these countries in Latin America that want to borrow from us. Why that didn't happen in East Asia? Well, because East Asian countries, for good or for bad, and that's another discussion for another day, at that moment they still have very tight controls, capital controls. So South Korea or Taiwan were not going to go on the market for those loans, or the firms in East Asia were not going to be on the market just because they had these very tight capital controls at the moment. So I think that that's the main point that we want to keep in mind. The second point we probably want to keep in mind is that there is one thing I will take a little bit of an issue with your description. There was a lot of investment of petrodollars in Western Europe. You know, Harrods overnight became owned by an Egyptian family. I think the main difference is the relative size of those investments with respect to the GDP. If you are the economy of the United Kingdom or you are the economy of Germany and suddenly you have $5 billion arriving from petrodollars, is something that your system can digest with relative ease. But if you are Chile and you have $2 billion, $3 billion in 1975, that's something that your economy is not large enough. So I think it's a combination of both the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the fact that countries react in very different ways to that collapse of Bretton Woods, and that the size of the Latin American economies was sufficiently small that even relatively small flows of capital can make a huge difference.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I would like to move to a topic that I would say that is maybe a little bit controversial about Latin American economic history, and is the role of the state-owned enterprises. We have all the discussion about well, basically what was going on here is a kind of misallocation of all those resources. And my first question is for Professor Carlos Vegh. During the import substitution era, state-owned enterprise became important players in several Latin American economies. And we say that in most of the Latin American economies, they were the big players. Also, they were the major recipient of international loans during the 70s. However, several observers, several scholars argue that many of those companies showed actually a very poor performance in terms of returns and in terms of management. So it could be the case that all that money was allocated in inefficient companies or inefficient enterprise. And that would mean that all that capital inflows didn't need an increase in competitiveness or an increase in productivity. Do you agree with that interpretation that basically there was a point of misallocation of resources during the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, that as you very correctly point out, I mean, is one of the most hotly debated topics in Latin American history in the last 50 years. And I feel, I mean, I tried to find formal papers trying to model the dynamics of an economy that is trying to grow through import substitution. I mean, I even sent an email to Andrés Rodríguez Clare, because I thought that he had written a paper on that, but he told me, I wish I had written the paper, but I have not. So this is a tremendous debate, and I read quite a bit in the last week. I mean, for the panel, and because as Latin American, we are all fascinated by these issues. Okay, so let me say 3 quick points, because I know that time is of the essence. I mean, first, perhaps a minor thing, but it is important, you know, many people include it in the readings. If you read Prebisch, Singer, you know, I mean, talk about import substitution, but really the way to think about this between 1950 and 1980 is to think about a state-led industrialization policy, because it was much more than import substitution. It was this huge development bank, this huge commercial banks, credit allocation, multiple exchange rate, capital controls, and a monopoly role in public investment, particular in infrastructure. So this should be viewed as a state-led industrialization policy. I mean, it was much more than simply substituting imports. So how did Latin America fare in this 1950-1980, which can be viewed as the height, quote unquote, of the state-led industrialization policy? Well, it really has not much to say, because it took countries that, I mean, let me just say that the average per capita growth was 2.7% between 1950 and 1980. The world average was 2.6. So we were not doing worse than the world, but not better. But what is important is that the growth that did occur during this state-led industrialization was due to the big countries, in particular Zealand and Mexico. I mean, because of the huge domestic market, right? So those can have like 15, 20 years that can take advantage of the domestic markets to grow. But if you look at the rest of the Latin America, was very bad. For instance, the Southern cone was growing at 1.4, the Central American at 1.8. So this was not a good performance. And then very quickly, you know, there were many distortions that happened to be introduced, capital flows, as I mentioned, multiple multiple exchange rate, a very heavy anti-bias towards agricultural sectors, and also exports, very heavy investment in capital heavy industry, that which favors the rich at the cost of the poor. So just to summarize, this was not a good state-led industrialization politic. And to complete, you know, this is interesting because if you read, which I have been reading papers by Vegh and Singer, you know, the old CEPAL people who pushed this in the 1940s. I mean, it's fascinating to read Vegh in the 1950s, 1960s. You can see a very bright economist, whether one agrees on this, whether one agrees or not, but he was very disappointed of the state-led industrialization model. So I think that even though this is a matter for debate, I think it is fair to say that the state-led industrialization policy, at the very least, was not very successful.
Thank you very much, Professor Vegh. Now I would like to continue that discussion about state-owned enterprises. And I have a question for Professor Fernández Villaverde. My question is, we have some examples of economies with accelerated economic growth periods that at the same time have large state-owned enterprises. So I am thinking, for instance, in the so-called East Asian economic miracles during the second half of the 20th century. Why in those later cases we have no a situation where state-owned enterprises are a constraint for economic growth or for economic development? So why we have a different case that what happened in the case of Latin America?
Yeah, thank you. So I have been thinking a lot about it. And if any of the people in the audience is interested, I just published a very long essay in a Spanish newspaper on precisely this type of topics on the semiconductor industry. As you probably know, there is a lot of discussion right now about using industrial policy to push for semiconductor industry in Europe. And I spent some time in that essay. You can go to my webpage and get to it, discussing what worked and what didn't work in East Asia and comparing it with other countries. So first of all, let me be very clear. At the very end of the day, we are not sure. We don't really know if East Asian countries develop thanks to or despite their industrial policy. So that's something that we must always keep in mind. I think that the preponderance of the evidence, and I'm using here a legal term that says that the evidence seems to be going in that direction, but it's not overwhelming, is that in some cases, industrial policy in East Asia seems to have worked, and state-owned enterprises seem to have helped. Now, what I have argued in several occasions, in several papers, is that this was probably the combination of very specific factors. First, an extremely motivated civil service with extreme nationalist views, a very strong foreign enemy that implies that you really need to industrialize if you don't want to be conquered, and a big ability of the institutions in that country to resist pressure groups, both from unions and firms and private firms. And that's my understanding of why South Korea state-owned enterprises work in South Korea. You have a very, very well-motivated and very highly educated civil service in Korea, extremely nationalistic, extremely worried that if South Korea doesn't grow, North Korea is going to come and is going to invade us. So there is no moment over here for nonsense and populist policies, and that resist pressures from both unions and firms and private interest. And something that also people tend to forget is these state-owned enterprises are going to work and they are going to be successful because South Korea is going to use the police to keep the wages of these workers very low. Okay, so it always fascinates me because a lot of the people who use South Korea as an example of industrial policy tend to be on the left. And I always tell them, yes, I understand where you're coming from, but really the key for those firms was that wages were really very, very low. And if you complain, the police will come and beat you up. While in Pemex was the other way around. I mean, Enrique knows this better than I do. But as far as my understanding goes, getting a job at Pemex meant that you were going to be hugely overpaid with respect to any other job with similar level of qualification. And that in general in Latin America, state-owned enterprises were paying better wages. And that was part of the motivation for Previs and Singer and Celso Furtado. So yes, state-owned enterprises work, but they usually work because A, you can resist the pressure of private groups, and because you are going to pay very little to workers. And if you are willing to accept these two situations, yes, they can work.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, I would like to continue with that discussion about state-owned enterprises. But my question for Professor Mendoza would be specifically about Mexico. So in the case of Mexico, how important state-owned enterprise were as recipient of international loans in the 70s? So we have said that that was general pattern in Latin America, in the whole region, but what about the particular case of Mexico? And related with that, how these state-owned enterprises navigated the lack of foreign capital during the 80s. I mean, once the crisis came, so how they survived that lack of capital inflows.
Thank you, Ivan. Just a quick corollary on Jesus's comments here is the jobs at Pemex were so cozy, they were actually, you could inherit them to your children. So they were not just overpaid, but they were really more assets than anything else. You could pass them on to your children until fairly recently. And the same was true of the teachers' jobs. This is just how distorted some of things are in this context. But to your point about the SOS in Mexico during this particular period, they were a major player. As I was telling you earlier, Mexico's economy by 1982 was essentially a borderline socialist economy. It had been through 12 years of left-leaning populist administrations. The government owned not only the oil company and the large utilities, which was fairly common across the world back then. So it owned the electricity company, the telephone, the airlines, but it owned all kinds of other things, medium and large businesses, bottling companies, hotel chains, the newspapers, you name it. It also had several major banks. So it had a very strong footing in the financial system, so-called development banks. And in 1982, it ended up nationalizing the entire banking system. The vast majority of these small open state-owned enterprises were highly inefficient. They were non-competitive and they had low productivity. They were protected by strong tariff and non-tariff barriers. This is the part where the import substitution connects with the topic. Then the economy collapsed in the summer of 1982 with a large devaluation. It was followed by a near decade-long stagnation. So you look at the Mexican statistics, and this also comes back to some points that Carlos and Jesus were making earlier. The GDP per capita of Mexico will not reach the level it had at the end of the 1970s until the early 1990s. So this is how prolonged and deep the stagnation was. Now, as the economy collapsed, the political regime switched. So it's the same regime. Mexico was governed by a single-party system called the PRI that had governed the country since the end of the Civil War in the 1930s. But it was a survivalist regime. So seeing 12 years of this and the debacle that it had resulted, it changed from being populist to becoming, I guess you can call it centrist, pragmatic. It started to dismantle the socialist practices one by one, opening the economy to international trade, removing many of the regulations and controls, and selling most of the state-owned enterprises, except for the oil company and the power company. So the short answer is that the Mexican SOEs did not navigate the 1980s. They essentially sank. They were privatized, and after that, some of them disappeared, and others were significantly restructured. Interestingly, and this is the final thing that I would say, the privatization of the phone company created the wealth of the person who is now the 10th richest person on earth, and at some point in the past few years was at the very top of the list. This is a gentleman by the name of Carlos Slim. He runs a large monopoly and meddles in politics. Whether that is an improvement or not is also heavily debated.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendoza. Now we'd like to move to the topic about properly the management of the crisis and the default. And my initial question is for Professor Fernández Villaverde, and is which similarities and difference can we find between what happened in Latin America in the 1980s and the Eurozone, the crisis of 2008.
Thank you. So similarities, I'm going to build on what Enrique was mentioning on Mexico. You have countries like Spain, who are in the middle of a real estate bubble, and politicians think that this is permanent, that you are going to generate the incredible tax revenues that come from being in the middle of a bubble for the rest of eternity. So they borrow like crazy. And the second thing is the excess liquidity in the financial sector at the global level. In the case of the early 2000s, there is just too much funds. You know, some people have called it the savings glut after Bernanke and Gourinchas. And, you know, Spain or Portugal or Greece are good places to park that excess liquidity. So those two things, you know, the presence of a lot of liquidity and local politicians treating transitory shocks as permanent shocks, I think are the same. The big difference, well, at the end of the day, is that Spain or Italy or Greece were part of the Eurozone and that they receive a huge bailout package, both directly through some loans, but also indirectly through the European Central Bank buying the debt of these countries and ensuring, with Mario Draghi's famous statement, whatever it takes to save the euro. In that sense, I think that, you know, a friend of mine always makes the joke that the main, if he could just pick one, he's from Uruguay, like Carlos, so if he could just pick one desire or one wish, it would be to take out Uruguay from the Cono Sur and take it to Europe, just because in that way you will qualify for the Eurozone and then you can be rescued by the ECB. And I think that that was the main difference, the ECB and the one.
For sure. That is our main hope for the future.
Exactly. Geographical reallocation.
We should be able to pick up relocation. We have to create some new markets.
Exactly. No, but
hay que hacer así, meterlo en ser.
I was just recently, one of the arguments I have always made about the advantages of being a part of the European Union is that the European Union prevents the craziest things from politicians. Right.
Yes.
So it's actually this very morning, if you look at the news, one of the largest Spanish companies is moving to the Netherlands. The government is super unhappy, has been trying to prevent them from doing it, but at the end of the day, that's incompatible with the rules of the European Union.
Yeah.
So you really have a discipline that comes from Brussels, which is in countries like Spain is absolutely invaluable.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernández Villaverde. Now we'd like to focus properly on the default wave in Latin America. And my next question is for Professor Enrique Mendoza. So in the early 1980s, almost all countries in Latin America fell into default. In that context, my question is, have those countries any other alternative? So it was, there was any other pathway or any other possibility? And related with that, have we here a problem of either ability to pay or a problem of a willingness to pay? So what kind of problem were facing policymakers at that time?
Thank you, Ivan. This is actually a great question. I think we can ask it to persons involved in every single financial debacle you can think of, whether it is in the public or the private sector. You could ask the same question to the Silicon Valley Bank owners, or you can ask it to the owners of Lehman Brothers back in 2008. A country, you can always say, has assets it could use to repay. It has been drawn, the idea has been floated about oil fields in the countries that are all rich. It was floated in the context of Greece about using the Greek islands as payment. It was a copper pit, you know, you name it. But the people that suggest using these assets to pay are being naive about the causes and the consequences of a sovereign default. Now, in the academic literature, in the models we work with, we focus heavily on the willingness to pay side to explain the decision, the act of a sovereign choosing not to repay at a particular point in time. But even in these models, the incentives for the sovereign to choose not to repay out of willingness are stronger when the income of the nation, or more precisely of the government, is low. And particularly more so if it's expected to be low for a while. So it's in a sense the expectation that the ability to pay is weakening that incentivizes the unwillingness to pay. In addition, we also must consider, and I think this is very important, the size of the lenders. Why do lenders repeatedly lend so much to borrowers with a history of serial default? And since they do, shouldn't they share in the burden of adjustment when a default happens? In the specific, this again, just relevant when you think about the European debt crisis, but that's not the question you're asking. In the specific case of Latin America in the 80s, the actual trigger was the correction in oil prices and the broader sale of commodity prices, together with a sharp rise in interest rates. So that's similar to the situation today in the sense that the US was back then starting the process of disinflation, a period of high interest rates to bring the high inflation rate down in what now we call the Volcker disinflation. So you had collapsing commodity prices of these folks who had thought prices were going to be high forever, and at the same time, rising world interest rates. So I told you by December of 79, the real price of oil had peaked at about $149 in real terms. By 1986, it had fallen to about $30.
Wow.
So it's a massive collapse, inflation adjusted, so massive collapse. So Mexican government by then was collecting about 2/3 of its revenues from oil. So it basically meant, to your question about ability to pay, they just didn't have the revenue, didn't have the cash flow to make, not just forget about repaying the debt, could not make the interest payments on the debt. The debt was also shorter maturity. So as things got more and more complicated as we go later into the 1980s, and world interest rates increased, the burden of servicing the debt got heavier, and the prospects of being able to roll over the debt were worsening quite rapidly. But I think this is not really the original cause. So I go back to the point, the true cause was the irresponsible debt policy of the populist government that we had in the 1980s. One of the key things that we teach in the international macro courses at the university is that countries should not react to temporary gains in their terms of trade and treat them as permanent. Terms of trade is the price of the things they export relative to those they import, which is exactly what the Mexican government did. Obviously, if you look at the history of what's going on, you see it's due to war, due to geopolitical things. So all the signs were there not to treat this as a permanent gain. But that's nevertheless what the regimes did. This was the major mistake in external borrowing policy of several countries that were commodity rich at that point, not just Mexico.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I would like to talk a little bit about the role of multilateral organizations. So my next question is for Professor Carlos Vegh. There is this common wisdom that it took a lot of time to solve the crisis in the case of Latin America. So people contrast the Latin American experience with what happened in the case of the Asian financial crisis, when the IMF and other multilaterals reacted very quick, and that helped in the solution of that crisis. So my question would be, how did multilateral organizations, say World Bank, the IMF, even the Inter-American Development Bank, react to the crisis? And how can we evaluate or assess that management?
Yeah. So this is, of course, a very, very important question, because we need to be able to and understand how was the role of the IMF to see if we can improve on this or not. Here, very quickly, because I know that time is of the essence, I am gonna make three short observation. So the first is that one, and I went back to some of the literature on this, is that it is very surprising that the IMF could not have foreseen a little bit more the big 1982 crisis, given the fact of all that they had been borrowing from the part of Latin American countries in the late 70s and late 80s. I mean, I was reading some IMF analysis of this, and they claim that before the 92 crisis erupted, the IMF had been meeting with some Mexican official to see how a possible help from the fund would look like and so forth. But I think that it is fair to say that if fact of the matter was that the IMF did not understand the severity of the 1982 death crisis, to the point, and this is amazing, that only two weeks before the moratorium of Mexico, some U.S. commercial banks were still lending to Latin American countries. So that is tell you that the fund did not properly understand what is going on. So second point, very quick, I think it is very important to keep in mind that here the key of objective of the fund, and of course of the U.S. government that was very much behind the fund, was to keep the fictitious account that this was a liquidity crisis, not a solvency country, solvency crisis, and the idea was to be able to say that on paper the U.S. U.S. commercial banks were fine, simply because the IMF would lend countries to service the debt. I mean, of course, no payments of principal took place, but that allowed the U.S. and U.S. commercial banks to publicly say that the commercial bank was completely sound. I mean, which was not true. So that is a very important point. I think the last point, which to me is the key point for developing countries, was that the key question here was the timing of the default, right? Because the cartel of commercial banks were only provide loans under very heavy conditionality, so as not to have to recognize any partial default. So that, I think, worked very well to the US commercial bank, but not very well to Latin America, because basically what happened was that Latin America between 1982 and 1989, I mean, those 7 years, that is the lost decade. Of course, I mean, of course, Latin American countries had no chance of being able to initiate an economic recovery, because by the time that the Brady bonds came into the picture in 1989, it was a typical situation of too little too late, because for 7 years, the macroeconomic situation in Latin America had been very bad. So to conclude, here one has the big question that I think it is still unsettled, which is, if you believe that a partial default is gonna have to happen, and with the Brady bonds in 1989, the average haircut was 30%. Why not coordinate a partial default early on, rather than let the whole process procrastinate for 7 years and have as a result the so-called lost decade.
Thank you very much, Professor Vegh. Well, we will now have our final round of questions. I would like to continue with that discussion about the 1980s and the lost decade. And well, what we can see here is that in the second half of the 80s, we have a further deterioration of the situation. So it will go on the period of the hyperinflation in several countries in the region. So my first question here is for Professor Enrique Mendoza, and it's related with this, and is why the recovery from the crisis was so slow. So we have already discussed a little bit of that, but I think that this is an interesting question. I mean, considering that several observers call that decade as the lost decade. We have the question.
Yes, thank you. This is another great question. And some of it, Carlos just covered. So coming back again to things we know in international macroeconomics and we teach in college. So one of the few things we are sure of empirically is that the current account is countercyclical, which means that it tends to go into deficit when countries are growing, and it tends to go into surplus when things are not going very well. Now, the current account is the broadest measure of the access to international credit that an economy has. What that tells you, and this is true actually across industrial and developing countries. So what that tells you is that what was going on in the 1980s was terrible. The process, the main reason, to answer your question in one sentence, is that it was because countries completely lost access to international capital markets. So their current accounts switch into surplus, or they move very close to zero, precisely at a point in time where it was worse for them because they were stagnated. Many of them were not growing. Certainly in per capita terms, most of them were declining. So they not only they could not borrow, so fresh credit, they suffer from what we call the debt overhang. From that period where you had such high debt levels that just to service the debt, just to pay the interest on the debt, you had to run primary fiscal surpluses that were excessive on economies that were already in recession. In the advanced economies, we're used to think, and this is something that Carlos has worked a lot on, we are used to the fact that we can relax fiscal policy to provide relief during recessions. What was going on in these countries in this period was a period of deep recession in which we had to tighten fiscal policy because we needed more revenue so we could keep up with servicing the debt. So this relates also to what Carlos was saying. It was not until the international community recognized that these countries will not be able to recover, will not be able to gain a growth path until the debt burden was lightened and they could start to run current account deficits. And until that was recognized and serious efforts for debt relief were adopted in the form of the Brady Plan, things did not start to improve. And that is how slow that was, that is remarkable. It's very painful. And it was very costly to this region. But before that plan, we had several others, like the Baker Plan and other collection of funky names people like to put their names on things, which completely failed because they provided little or not debt relief. And I conclude the answer with this. So unfortunately, economists and politicians tend to forget the lessons from history. And the same mistake was being made during the European debt crisis. So I was at a panel in the Bundesbank, and a Bundesbank conference, where I bring all these facts from the 70s and 80s to the table, and the answer from some of the panelists was that Europe was not Latin America. And my reply to them was, if you continue like this, you're going to make sure that it does look like Latin America. So several of the early attempts at fixing the problem in Europe failed precisely because they did not include enough debt restructuring. Of course, you want to change trying to change things so that you don't end up having to restructure debt again in 10 years. I don't have any problem with that. But that once you are there with the debt overhang killing the country, you have to do something that includes debt restructuring. And because it didn't, we've got stuck for several years in a really terrible situation.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendoza. A reminder for our attendees that we are in the final round of questions. So if you maybe have a question, so we'll have some few minutes at the end. So feel free to post them on the Q&A tool. My next question is for Professor Carlos Vegh. Is for I would say that it's probably the most complicated part of the crisis, and is about about the hyperinflation period that unfortunately characterized several economies in the region in the second half of the 80s. So my question is, why instead of a recovery in Latin America, the initial crisis was followed by a wave of hyperinflation? So we have several cases like Argentina in 1989, Brazil in 1990, early in Bolivia in 1984. So why the situation deteriorated even further? We ended with hyperinflation, and in some cases, the absolute collapse of currencies like the Cruzeiro in Brazil or the Australian in Argentina.
Yeah, sure. So here, what took place really is very much part of the mid 1970s and late in 1970s, in which many Latin American countries had a budget deficit, but those budget deficit was, I mean, could be financed by financial repression and in particular by foreign capital. So what happens starting in 1982 is that in spite of the fund trying to impose a lot of conditionality to lend money in, as Enrique was saying, a very pro-cyclical fiscal policy way, and that's what we have been trying to take issue for many years. But after the sovereign debt crisis, I mean, many countries still have fiscal deficit because the fund programs were simply not enough, and also many state-owned enterprises, particularly in Argentina and also Brazil, simply did not have the possibility of borrowing from abroad to finance fiscal deficit. So basically, they had to resort to money printing, and that is the explanation basically. And you can also see that in the hyperinflations of Bolivia 1985, then Brazil in 1988, Argentina in 1989, that the fiscal deficit was so big that the monetary financing of the fiscal deficit was very high, to the point that by 1990, the median inflation rate in the region was 40%, and the mean was 1,000% because of the hyperinflations in Bolivia, in Argentina. So just to complete the thought and not to take more time, the inflation finance, the high inflation was a very direct consequence of the fact of capital inflows drain out, and the incapacity of country governments of collecting taxes, because in all three countries, particularly in Bolivia and Argentina, tax revenues plummeted completely. So that explains the hyperinflations in Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia.
Thank you very much, Professor Vegh. My next question is for Professor Fernández Villaverde. Hyperinflation, it seems like one of the worst case scenario in a crisis. Certainly, it's something that policymakers wanted to avoid. Thinking what happened in Latin America from a historical perspective, which similarities and difference can we find between what happened in Latin America in the 1980s and other episodes of hyperinflation in economic history? For instance, the German hyperinflation of the early 1920s.
Very quickly, the main similarities, both of them came out from huge fiscal deficits that governments decide to finance through monetization. What I think is different is the source of those fiscal deficits. In Latin America was the inability to generate enough revenue to pay for the different spending programs that governments have committed. In the case of Germany, was the unwillingness of the German public to accept that they have been defeated in World War I and they need to pay reparations. But at the end of the day, those are in some sense details. What really matters is you have a huge fiscal deficit and you think you are going to finance it by printing money, and hyperinflation always comes. It's just unavoidable.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernández Villaverde. With that remark, we will conclude our round of questions. We have a final question by one of our attendees. It's also for Professor Fernández Villaverde about the contrast between East Asia and Latin America in the state-owned for the state-owned enterprises. The question is, you may be thinking that there are some cultural differences that played a role in both cases. So maybe there was any something in the culture in East Asia that led to a better management in these enterprises.
I will not call these differences cultural. I think they were more political economy differences. The situations were different. I think that the existence of a foreign enemy focuses your attention a lot. There is a great sociologist called Charles Tilly that has this famous line, the war makes the state and the state makes war. And basically you are South Korea, and the problem is you set up a factory and it doesn't work very well. This is not an issue about whether or not we are going to default tomorrow. This is an issue, some communist guy may come tomorrow and kill me. And I think that if you are Brazil in 1975, who is going to invade you? No one. So there is really not a very strong incentive to be serious about this. And I think that's exactly the same reason why in the 19th century, Spain never developed a good higher education system. Well, France did. France needed engineers to fight wars against Germany. Spain didn't. So France has Polytechnique, Spain has Polytechnica. Everyone has heard about Polytechnique. Nobody has ever heard about Polytechnica. That's it. War makes states and the states make wars.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernández Villaverde. And thank you very much, Professor Carlos Vegh and Professor Enrique Mendoza. And of course, again, thank you very much, Professor Fernández Villaverde, to be here to share with us your insights and your knowledge about these major event in Latin American economic history. Thank you very much also for our attendees. Just a quiet reminder that we have our next lecture next week. We will talk about the period of structural reforms in the 1990s. Thank you very much and have an excellent week. See you on Tuesday.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gracias,
Yeah.
Enrique. Gracias, Carlos.
Okay.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you.